Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books. And Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore and also the school store partner for Agnes Scott College. We're delighted to be celebrating the work of one of our faculty members at Agnes Scott College tonight, Rafael Ocasio, and to also be kicking off our Latinx Heritage Month celebration. Now, technically, this celebration began on September 15th, but that also was an important Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur. So we have moved our first inaugural night to tonight, the 17th, to honor the multiplicity of our communities. So we're joined tonight as well by a former Agnes Scott community member, Rosemary Lévy Zumwalt, who is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the College Emirata at Agnes Scott College. She's the author of Franz Boas, The Emergence of the Anthropologist, and the forthcoming Franz Boas, Establishing Anthropology and Working for Social Justice, both of which were published with the University of Nebraska Press. She is co-author with William Shedrick Willis of Franz Boas and W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University, 1906. And the author of numerous books, including Elsie Clues Parsons, Wealth and Rebellion, Anthropologist and Folklorist, and American Folklore Scholarship, A Dialogue of Dissent. So we are delighted to have Rosemary back. I know many of you from the Agnes Scott community are welcoming her back with love in the chat, so we'd love to see that. And of course, the person of the hour tonight is Rafael Ocasio, who is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Spanish at Agnes Scott College. He is the author of 2 books on dissident writer Ronaldo Arenas, who is Cuba's political and sexual outlaw, and The Making of a Gay Activist is the second title. His other books include Latin American Culture and Literature, Afro-Cuban Costumbrerizo, you're going to have to correct me on that one, From Plantations to the Slums, The Bristol, Rhode Island, and Matanzas, Cuba Slavery Connection, The Diary of George Howe, and recently published Our Race and Nation in Puerto Rican Folklore, Franz Boas and John Alden Mason in Puerto Rico, and of course the book we are here to celebrate tonight, Folk Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico. So we're delighted always to celebrate you, Rafa, and one of the things we were just saying in the green room is that you are not only one of the most prolific writers at Agnes Scott, you're also one of the most generous and beloved professors. So it's rare to have that combo, and we do especially want to honor you for it and celebrate you. So I want to encourage folks wherever you're watching from, if you have questions for Rafa or for Rosemary tonight, feel free to put them in the Ask a Question box at the bottom center of the screen. If you're on your phone and it's a little difficult to type, you're welcome to put them in the chat and I'll move them over. And I'll pop back up towards the end. Rosemary will invite me back up and I'll ask the questions from the community if we have any burning questions. But I'm going to get out of the way now and let this wonderful conversation begin. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you, ER. That was a wonderful introduction. And I noticed that you almost got out of breath listing Rafa's publications, and I understand why one would. So I'm honored to be here tonight, and as you mentioned, ER, I'm touched by all of the dear friends who are sending their thoughts to us in the sidebar. I guess it's the chat. Who knows? I think it's a chat. Yes. So, Rafa, I want to know how you got involved in writing about Puerto Rican folk stories.
Thank you, Rosemary. But let me say hello to everybody and happy Latinx Heritage Month. And ER, it's costumbrismo. We'll need to give you some Spanish lessons. I'll be glad to do that. Thank you very much for that introduction. Rosemary, my coming into this book was basically a strike of luck. You may remember that I was very close to Judith Ortiz-Cofer. Judith Ortiz-Cofer was born in Puerto Rico in 1954, and she grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. She comes into the history books as the first Latinx writer to be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Line of the Sun. That year, Oscar Hijuelos was also nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his novel Mambo Kings, and he won the Pulitzer Prize this year. Judith continued her publication throughout the years, mainly short story novels and poetry. And she was very inspired by Puerto Rican folklore. At one point, she started sending me a series of stories that she called her reinterpretations of Puerto Rican folktales. And some of the stories sounded very familiar to me. So one afternoon, I sat down and ran a Google search on the stories, and voila, what I found out was that Franz Boas had been in Puerto Rico with a young anthropologist folklorist in 1914, 1915, and they compiled a huge number of stories. Some of the stories that they compiled, Judith knew from oral folklore through her grandmother in Puerto Rico. And that was literally the beginning of the project. How Franz Boas arrived to Puerto Rico. Why did he decide on Puerto Rico as opposed to any Latin American or Caribbean country? And how was that collection collected? To this day, the collection is the largest collection of oral folklore ever collected from a Latin American country or territory in Spanish.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting, Rafa. I knew that you had spoken about Judith Ortiz Cofer and how she had led you to this work, but I didn't put it all together. So that's fascinating. And I see a related question. How does this book fit with your other research?
I have always been interested in culture. I guess because I was a Spanish instructor for so long, and we are trained as analysts of cultures, or we're trained to look at culture not quite in the same way that you, Rosemary, most likely will look into culture. We are trained to look at how culture appears in popular culture or appears as some formal components in literature, in cinema, etc. So my training was always focused on that. And also as a Puerto Rican living in the United States, I was very interested in learning about other cultures, other Latin American cultures. Throughout the years, I have had the pleasure of meeting so many people from so many parts of Latin America here. And my sweetest memories are of parties where there are people from Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Argentina, and then we start comparing national cultural events, religious events, food. We celebrate our connection through so many ways, because in many ways, yes, the cultures are different, but in many other ways, the cultures are very similar.
Yeah, that's fascinating, really fascinating. So as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you translated all of these stories in this book from the collection from Spanish.
So let me give you a background of the stories. The stories were collected in two ways. The first way, Franz Boas's assistant, John Alden Mason, who was a very young anthropologist, recently graduated from Berkeley. He transcribed many of the stories, but Franz Boas, and this is what's the most interesting part of this project that Franz Boas developed in Puerto Rico. Franz Boas wanted to collect the largest amount possible, not only of stories, we're talking about conundrums, songs, fables, poetry, songs, rhymes for children. And in order for that to happen, they decided that they were going to train people who were already well known on the island as storytellers. But and this is what's interesting of my project, I think, that many children in the public school system wrote for Boas and Mason. So my role as an editor was to take those stories and see what I could do to bring them, to update them in a new format, in a more less oral format. And I started with the Spanish versions, and those were the versions that I translated into English.
I see. And so what did you find the most difficult aspect of translating? My husband of blessed memory did a lot of translating, and I know the agony he put into translating, because you can't just it's not just a matter of knowing the language and how to substitute words. There's got to be tone and intent. So what did you find to be the most difficult aspect of translating?
The first difficult task was to make the stories sound less oral. As you know, Rosemary, Spanish has the tendency to write long sentences. So that was the first problem. What do you deal with these very long sentences? I realized that one of the reasons the original sentences were very long was that they were very oral. So there were many conjunctions connecting many subordinate clauses. And some of the subordinate clauses could easily be eliminated. And certainly all of those conjunctions, the and so and then could be easily either eliminated, or I could easily find better transitions without those conjunctions there. But the real difficult part was, what do you do when you have a series of terms that are so cultural and so rural based that you do not want to have a text full of footnotes explaining such and such word means this. So what I did in that case, I tried to find as many equivalent words, terms already present in the rural vocabulary, particularly of the rural South. So that came in very handy. Often they were almost equivalent. Sometimes they were not, but they were close enough that the reader will get the gist.
So interesting. So you've mentioned that in talking with Judith Ortiz Cofer, that you had memories of these stories from your childhood, that they were resonant with your experience in your childhood. Did your mother tell you these stories as bedtime stories, or
No.
Did you pick them up at school?
Yes. No, I didn't hear them from my mother, but yes, they were very present in various other ways. There would always be a neighbor who would have a story or two to tell us, particularly those stories that will tell children to behave. Yes. Or to be aware of strangers, because any stranger can be a foe. But most of the stories I knew were found in primers. My generation literally learned to read from reading these stories. And also my generation also learned basic analysis reading these stories.
Oh, interesting.
So I remember, like it is today, reading these stories, and there would be a series of questions. Who is the narrator? Who is the protagonist? What is his problem? What is the solution to the problem? How does he encounter his antagonist? And of course, those students of mine are saying something like, okay, so you're still doing the same trick, because I still have students doing that very basic analysis, and it does work. As you know, Rosemary, the fables, the oral folklore stories are very formulaic. that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they have to be, you know, their stories, they're short stories, and in a very short amount of words, they have to convey all of that information. So the information is conveyed in very precise ways.
Yes, yes. Oh, that's wonderful. I would really love to have you read the passage in the middle paragraph on page 26. It's the passage where you talk about your biographical connection and to these stories and your parents.
Yes.
Would you read that, and then, if you wish, expand on it a bit too?
Definitely. So as a way of introducing the passage that you like so much, Rosemary, I like to remind those people who are listening to us and who are planning to buy and read the book, and hopefully you'll buy the book through Keras. The stories that we are reading, or that I will be reading, were collected in the countryside. They are overwhelmingly the settings are overwhelmingly the Puerto Rican countryside. There are characters that belong to that countryside and the problems that these people had living in the countryside. Remember that the stories were collected between 1914 and 1915. So the Puerto Rican countryside back then was very tough. It was very tough living. I should say that I am the first generation born in San Juan, and I'm very proud of having been born in San Juan. However, I am also very proud of having been born of two parents who were Jíbaros, or peasants. The word Jíbaro in Puerto Rico is very important because we sort of make the Jíbaro the repository of Puerto Rican culture. When we think of what is native of Puerto Rico, we always think of this inhabitant of the countryside. So from my parents, both of them born on the countryside, and both of them came to San Juan at various moments of their lives. My mother was a preteen. My father was a young man who came to San Juan to work in a bank. From them, I learned about life in the countryside. From them, I learned to like and to dislike, because I don't like all of the traditions of the countryside, just as my mother did not like many of the traditions of the countryside. So the paragraph that you want me to read talks about that. This is also my humble testimony as the child of two proud Jíbaros whose memories of growing up in the tierra adentro, hinterland, shaped my liking and also disliking of native Puerto Rican traditions, whether it is música jíbara, country music, my father's favorite pastime on Saturday afternoons, or my mother's comida criolla, Creole cooking. No one can make pasteles like her. To my parents, I owe my love and passion for the native culture of La Isla de Puerto Rico, the island of my dreams, even after having lived for so many years afuera. Living outside is a Puerto Rican's polite but also political euphemism for refusing to refer to the United States as the mainland.
That's so interesting. I love that. I do. So I note that your book is redolent with memories, and you, of course, dedicate it to Agnes Scott, College Emerita Associate Professor of Spanish, M. Eloise Herbert of blessed memory. And so I wanted you to tell us a bit about Professor Herbert. Did you talk with her about your work on Puerto Rican narratives?
Eloise Mary Herbert was my mentor ever since I came to Agnes Scott in 1989. He became my mentor before that was an official task imposed by the dean of the college. After her retirement, 2 years after I got to the college, we kept in touch. My biggest and my sweetest memories with her is our Thursday afternoons meetings. We met every Thursday afternoon for a couple of hours, and many of the, I should say, all of my books were discussed with her. All of my crazy ideas were discussed during those conversations. To say that I miss her immensely, it's an understatement.
Yeah.
I know that I am the scholar I am today because she was there to listen to me.
Yeah, that's
Well,
wonderful. That's
so
wonderful.
that's why I dedicated these stories. We were working together on the translation of many of these stories before she unfortunately did not do well mentally. At the end of her life, she lost a lot of her mental capacity. But many of the stories we translated together.
Oh, that's a wonderful. I didn't know that. That's just
Yes,
wonderful.
yes. And I should
So,
also say that the second part, my second inspiration for this book is my sister Edna Ocasio Medina, who most likely is listening to this.
oh,
The last chapter of the anthology, Edna and I translated together.
oh, how lovely.
And
Well, Edna, hi. If you're listening to this, hi. She's my favorite, really. I won't choose her over you. That would not be politic, but she is
thank
my
you,
favorite.
Rosemary.
So here, now I have to ask, what was your favorite character in these stories when you were a child?
Well,
And is
when I
it the
was
same character now?
So when I was a child, of course, it had been Juan Bobo, and we'll
Sure.
talk about Juan Bobo because you like Juan Bobo as well. Juan
Right.
Bobo, there is no one Puerto Rican who does not know Juan Bobo for several reasons. One, it always appears in some kind of format, whether it's literary or, as I mentioned, as part of a primer for school children. But also because it has become the one character that sort of represents Puerto Rican values of dealing with harsh situations, harsh economic situations, harsh surroundings. And he's really funny.
Yeah, he is. He is.
And the character that I like now is the pirate Roberto Cofresí.
Oh, I can understand that. Yeah.
Roberto Cofresí was a pirate who was born on a town in the western coast of Puerto Rico. And he was kind of a Robin Hood character. He stole from the rich to give to the poor, but also, and this is the twist to that story, part of the money that he did not give away to the poor, he buried. And there is one story that explains how Roberto Cofresí could bury all of these treasures, and the treasures were never found.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful. A buried treasure story. Oh, that's
Yes.
wonderful.
And as you know, the Caribbean is full of these stories
Sure.
of buried treasures that are awaiting for people to discover.
Yeah, and so it's magical and mystical, and he's very powerful.
Yes.
It's a wonder. I can understand why you like him so much.
So if you're listening to this and you want to go to Puerto Rico to do treasure hunting, the western coast of Puerto Rico, Cabo Rojo in particular, where Cofresí was from and where he is reputed to have buried these treasures, is a beautiful coast. So I invite you to go. We need the tourism badly.
Yeah, Puerto Rico is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. I had the opportunity of going to Puerto Rico with my husband of blessed memory and his daughter, and Rafa and his mother and Edna were our wonderful hosts. It is an incredible place, really. So you're right. I loved Juan Bobo, but I appreciate your reflections on pirate Roberto Cofresí, because I can see why you like him so much. Now, I wanted to ask you to select a narrative, a folk story, to read aloud, in a portion in Spanish and a portion in English.
Okay,
Would you
well,
like to do that now?
I will do that. Yes, definitely. So, since you like Juan Bobo so much, I will read a short story that explains Juan Bobo. Juan Bobo, just as a brief introduction, Bobo means dummy in Spanish, but it can also mean someone who is slow, as in slow learner, for instance. And the stories about Juan Bobo will either place him as a slow learner or as a bobo because he is, or because he pretends to be. And in his pretending to be, that's his way of dealing with the crazy background of his household or the crazy environment that he sees himself. This one in particular explains how Juan Bobo came to be known as Juan Bobo. And I will go both in English and Spanish. So let me start with the English version. Juan Bobo sends the pig to mass. They say that once upon a time there was a lady who had only one son. His name was Juan, but because he was a dunce, everybody called him Juan Bobo. Since his mother was rich, she had many jewels, pretty clothes, and lots of farm animals. One day, the mother fixed herself up to go to mass. She had a pig tied up near the house. Before leaving for mass, she said to Juan Bobo, "Be careful that the sun does not hit the pig." She left Juan Bobo alone in the house. The mass was long, and Juan Bobo's mother was late in getting home. The sun was getting too hot, and the pig was beginning to grunt. Juan Bobo heard the animal grunting. Fool that he was, he thought that the pig was crying to go to mass with her mistress. He thought for a moment and said to the pig, "I am going to send you to mass." Immediately, Juan Bobo untied the animal. He took her into a room where his mother kept all of her jewels. He dressed the pig in his mother's best dress. He put earrings on the sow's ears and bracelets on her hooves. After getting the pig ready, he sent her to mass. Once, of course, the only thing bothering the sow was the heat, so she ran in a hurry toward a waterhole in the road to the house. She got filthy. She tore up the clothes that she was wearing, and she kicked off the jewelry. When the mother came home, she asked Juan Bobo about the pig. He told her that the pig had cried to follow her. He had dressed the pig and had sent her to mass. He asked his mother if she had not seen the pig in church. The mother, full of rage because of her son's stupidity, beat him very hard, hoping to keep him from being stupid again. But Juan Bobo kept on being stupid. Okay, and now in Spanish, for those Spanish speakers out there, Juan Bobo manda la cerda a misa. Se dice que había una vez una señora muy rica quien solo tenía un hijo. Su nombre era Juan, pero como era bobo, le llamaban Juan Bobo. Como su madre era rica, tenía muchas prendas finas y animales. Una vez la madre se fue para misa y dejó a Juan Bobo solo en la casa. Antes de salir para misa, la madre dejó una cerda amarrada cerca de la casa. Cuando fue a salir, le dijo Juan Bobo, «Ten cuidado que no le dé el sol a la cerda». Se tardó mucho en la misa y la señora no pudo venir antes. El sol calentaba demasiado y la cerda comenzaba a gruñir. Juan Bobo oyó que el animal gruñía, pero como bobo que era, pensó que la cerda estaba llorando por ir a misa también con su ama. Pensó un momento. yo te voy a mandar a misa. Luego cogió y desamarró el animal y lo llevó a una habitación donde la señora tenía todas sus prendas. Juan Bobo vistió la cerda con los mejores trajes de su madre. Le puso pantallas en las orejas y pulseras en las patas. Luego de prepararla, la mandó para misa. Seguramente que, como la cerda lo que tenía era calor, el animal corrió apresuradamente hacia un bañadero que se encontraba en el camino de la casa. Se ensució y rompió la ropa que llevaba puesta y botó las prendas. Cuando vino la madre, preguntó por la cerda. Juan Bobo respondió que ella había llorado por irse detrás de ella. Él la había vestido y la había mandado para misa. Le preguntó a la madre si no la había visto en la iglesia. La madre, llena de cólera por la torpeza del muchacho, le pegó muy fuerte para que así no fuera más bobo. Pero Juan Bobo siguió siendo siempre un bobo.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you, Rafa, for
Oh, you're
reading
welcome.
that. Yeah, that was wonderful. Now, of course, I wouldn't be an anthropologist if I didn't say that this is this strongly cross-cultural, this wise fool. And of course, you know that. And I won't beat this dead horse too much, but I must say that for the Navajo in the Southwest, it's the coyote. And for the American Indians in the Northwest, it's the raven. For the Sephardim, it's Juha. And there are so many stories of Juha that my husband of blessed memory told me, and we ended up writing a paper about Juha. For the Muslim Turkish people, it's Nasruddin Hoja. And for all of these people, and it goes on, I'm sure it goes around the world, because everybody seems to need a wise fool. And that's it. Juan Bobo is a wise fool, and the trickster is always a wise fool. He has wisdom, but he has wisdom in his foolishness. So he turns everything on its head. Sorry, couldn't help that.
No,
but that's why I just love Juan Bobo.
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons why there are so many stories of Juan Bobo in the collection that Boaz Mason documented is the fact that Boaz was very much interested in the connections that Puerto Rican folktales had with Spanish antecedents.
Yes.
It was very clear that even though, as you mentioned, there are also antecedents in the Native American culture, and Boaz had done research in Mexico as well, particularly doing anthropological surveys of the indigenous folktales there. In Puerto Rico, he was much more interested in the connections that these stories had with Spanish antecedents.
Yes.
In the case of Juan Bobo, what I have found is that there is no one Latin American country that does not have one type of character such as Juan Bobo.
I was wondering about that. Is there another culture that calls him Juan Bobo?
Yes, not Bobo,
Yes.
but usually Juan. Juan,
Okay.
I don't know why. I'm sorry if your name is Juan, but Juan, in the Hispanic tradition is usually a name that is given to Bobo characters, men or children who are slow learners, and so yes. Not only you will find characters like Juan Bobo, but often the tricks that he plays on several people, mother in this case, and neighbors, are very much alike.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. When I was a child, I know there was a character like Juan Bobo in one of my readers because he was making the terrible mistake of sitting on the end of a tree limb and sawing it off so that he would fall down with the bough. And then on another tale, he was carrying the donkey rather than riding on the back of the donkey. So he was doing stupid things. I'm not sure that I saw the wisdom, but he was awfully funny. So now I want to ask you, you've already said this, but when you were a child, were you aware of the didactic themes in the stories, of the kind of moral endings that some of these stories have?
Certainly, the Juan Bobo stories are full of anecdotes in which Juan Bobo pays for playing tricks. Although there are many other anecdotes in which he plays tricks and he is not punished. So it's almost 50-50. But the ones I guess people would like to tell children are the ones, be careful, don't be a smart boy, because it can happen that you will become like Juan Bobo.
Yeah, yeah. I noticed that the end of the Snow White, the Prince, and the Seven Dwarfs has that they never forgot to take care of each other. So that was a rather tender ending. And then at the end of Cinderella, it was, this is what, and I quote, "This is what happens to girls who are selfish and envious, and to those mothers who love one child more than another and want everything for that child."
Yes.
So there is a didactic moral that comes right at the end and
Yes.
drives home the point. If you didn't get it, children, this is what it is. Yeah.
What you're referring to, Rosemary, the character of Cinderella in Puerto Rico is called Cenizosa.
Yes.
And if you know Spanish, you already understood that Cenizosa comes from cenizas, ashes, because one of the tasks of this poor girl was to cook. And in the Puerto Rican countryside, the cooking was done with coals made out of burned wood. So the person cooking, which of course the women cooking, were always covered with ashes. And in the case of Cenizosa, she was constantly doing that. So, but the interesting part of the Cenizosa stories and the reference to that line is that the step daughter, the step sister, is always punished.
Yeah.
Cenizosa is granted all of this richness and all of these great gifts for being literally for being a good girl, and the stepdaughter is harshly punished.
Yes. Yeah. And since you mentioned harsh punishment, I wanted to turn to a question about
Yes.
when you were a child. Did the tales that you heard as a child have the elements of pain and cruelty in them that those in the books have? The book has, and I don't mean to criticize.
No.
That is the true element of folks' narratives. They've been cleaned up and sanitized in our Walt Disney World.
Well, speaking of Walt Disney World, the version that I know of Little Red Riding Hood growing up as a child is the very grotesque one that the wolf eats the grandmother, eats Caperucita as well, and then this man from the woods comes out and kills the wolf, and with the axe opens up the belly of the wolf, and come out the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood. There is a lot of violence in these stories and in the Puerto Rican stories. And what I have come to understand is that this was an environment that was very dangerous for children, including the fact that parents could be violent, could turn violent against their children.
Yeah.
And there's no other way to put it.
And so that was in the stories that you heard
Yes.
as a child. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the stories that I collected in my anthology. And mind you,
Yeah.
the stories that I collected are my favorite ones, and the ones that I thought would be more appealing to a modern reader, and ones that were not as violent. I left out many of them for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. So I really wanted you to talk a little bit about the, and I don't might say it wrong, but Taino inhabitants in Puerto
Yes.
Rico, the original inhabitants.
Okay. So Rosemary, you wrote about this on your first volume of your book, Franz Boas, The Emergence of the Anthropologist. Franz Boas, at the beginning or halfway into the Mexican Revolution, found himself in Mexico trying to start a school of anthropology because of the unexpected violence and political turbulence of Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. He decided to leave Mexico and he came to Puerto Rico. That was one of the reasons why he came to Puerto Rico in 1915. Your assumption and my assumption, I think, are right. Franz Boas was interested in making Puerto Rico a site for his students of anthropology at Columbia, that they could do field work in Puerto Rico. The most important finding of Franz Boas in Puerto Rico is a park, a religious park that functioned as a site for religious performance and for the enjoyment of a ball game that the native people of the Caribbean, known as Taínos, enjoyed. It looks very much like what the ball sports that the Central American indigenous people had, the Mayans and the Aztecs. That park is called Caguana. Boas knew it as Capa. Caguana is literally the largest anthropological park in the Caribbean, built by the Taínos. So that is the biggest contribution of Franz Boas as an anthropologist. Why Puerto Rico did not keep the attention for Franz Boas to continue his plans, we really do not know, or I couldn't find any reasons why he changed his mind. Your question is important because Caguana today is the site of pro-indigenous Taíno groups who are claiming ancestry as Taíno individuals. And as Taíno nations, they're claiming the rights of a political nation. So it's a very, I would say, daring proposition that these pro-Taíno groups are bringing to the forefront. Literally what they're saying is, I don't care about the rest of Puerto Rico, but us as pro-Taíno nations, we are our own nations. And thus we do not recognize the authority of the federal U.S. government on us. So I would be curious to see what Franz Boas would think about this turn of events, you know?
Yes, and I hate to say it, but my computer just cut out, and so I lost all of that. So you and I are going to have to go over that together.
No problem.
Yeah, later on. I was desperate. I mean, this has not been my technological day. So, but we're close to the end, and I know that everybody else benefited from that, even if I lost connection. I would love to hear you talk just briefly about Mason's work in Puerto Rico and what he emphasized in looking for the folk narratives.
Okay. Mason, as you know, was a recent graduate. He was very willing to do what Franz Boas wanted him to do. Of course, as we know, Franz Boas was this big name, and John Alden Mason was a rising scholar. He did a lot of preparation for Boas before Boas arrived in May of 1915. He was not only in charge of putting together that process that eventually had children from the public school system to write, but he also recorded some of the stories. Unfortunately, the stories were published without an indication of the source, so I cannot give you an exact amount of how much Mason transcribed, but also Mason was interested in recording music. And he went to the island with a Edison recorder, and he literally recorded, I can say, dozens of songs, because many of them, and perhaps even in the hundreds, because many of those recordings have survived.
That's so interesting. And ER, I dare say we have to bring this to a close. Rafa, this has been wonderful talking with you.
Oh, you're welcome. It has been great, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll call ER back. Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both. So Peggy Thompson has asked a great question. So Peggy says, Rafa, I would appreciate hearing more about what you mean by updating the stories and making them less oral. Isn't one essential characteristic of folktales their timelessness?
Yes. So, Peggy, the stories were very lengthy in the sense that they kept the oral nature of those individuals who transcribed the stories. Remember that two things: either the stories were transcribed, written by individuals who were well known as short story writers, or children. And it was very easy for me to decide which ones were written by children and which ones were written by adults, because the children's stories were short. The use of grammar was very imprecise. The use of compound tenses, the use of subjunctive was not as strong as other stories. So what I wanted to do was to update them to sound like modern Spanish. I eliminated a lot of the conjunctions that are proper in oral stories, the use of and, entonces, then, so on, and make them more cohesive. Many of the subordinate clauses in Spanish can be easily deleted, and nothing is lost.
So James Dietrich asks, Rafa, could you speak about the differences between working with the two presses you've primarily published with, the University Press of Florida and Rutgers University Press?
Yes, I have been blessed to be working with the University of Florida Press for many years now. I think, I forgot, four of my books, and I have one coming. The reason I like to work with Florida is because they're very specific in the kind of books that they want, and my mind works like that. I need to have a specific reader in mind when I write. Just like when I put together the syllabus for a literature class, I have in mind my readers, which are my students at Agnes Scott. So I'm very, very clear about that, in the sense that I have a perfect reader when I write. And Rutgers had started a series on Caribbean culture, and again the same format. In my mind, I was writing a book in which I was bringing out the crazy amount of work that went behind the presence of boas in the United States. Unbeknownst to me, my good friend Rosemary Zumwalt had already started working on it. So when I mentioned to her in passing, well, I'm doing this, she almost had a heart attack. It's like, oh my God, I'm doing the same thing. So the good thing about this process was the fact that as I am writing my book, I am chatting with Rosemary, I am bouncing out ideas. Some of the ideas she liked, some of the ideas she did not like. So I hope that she agrees with them in print form. But it was very exciting to, again, have a press that had a readership in mind. In this case, a series that talks about the contributions of the Caribbean world. In this case, the contributions of Boas in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that both Rosemary and I had very clear, and we agreed without doubt, is that this trip to Boas was a major ordeal for Boas. This was not like, okay, yes, I'm leaving Mexico, but now I'm going to Puerto Rico. This was a major decision on his part. And the background behind his trip was also major.
Wonderful. It looks like we have one more. So this is from Beth Hackett. How do you think we should deal with the fact that folk stories inevitably treat issues in ways that today we find troubling? For example, publishing folks with what today we might regard as intellectual disabilities. So the Juan Bobo, for example, right?
Yes. Beth, I was flabbergasted at the kind of stories that were published under the Juan Bobo series, because some of them were indeed very, very demeaning to people with mental disabilities. And in those stories, it was very clear that Juan Bobo had a mental disability. There's no way to put it in other words. So those are the ones that I did not use. The ones that I used are the ones in which they present the figure of a child trying to find his way in life, trying to find his place within this family, or trying to find his place in this crazy environment of the Puerto Rican countryside at the beginning of the century, because it was a very aggressive environment. It's very clear in many of the stories. But you're right, it was very hard. The same. I can make the same case. Rosemary already pointed out the violence against women is very obvious as
Pretty
well.
grim.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a great question and a great point.
Yes.
So can you tell us, Rafa? I put a link to the pre-order for your next book in the chat, but can you tell us just a little teaser about the Dissidents of Ronaldo Arenas?
Reinaldo Arenas comes into the history books as one of the first queer activists from Latin America in the 20th century. The one reason I like this guy so much, and I have been writing about him since I was in grad school. My dissertation was written in 1985. The reason I am so attracted to this guy is the fact that this is a man who fought for what he thought was fair in the sense of queer rights, or what we today call queer rights. And it really didn't matter to him to what extent it will affect him. Literally, this is a man who was tortured for literally publishing abroad. As much as I like, and my students have heard me say this many times, as much as I like to write, if someone would tell me, you better stop writing or I am going to give you the biggest punishment possible, I would be the first one stopping. I mean, I am not that person. And I admire people who have that tenacity, who see themselves as I don't know, who see themselves as people who have a mission, and it doesn't really matter whether it will end their lives.
Mhm.
So, so the new book brings the figure of Ronaldo as what can we learn in this crazy environment that we're living today? How can we learn about activism from this guy? It's a way of updating his in-your-face activism.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. I think we have all learned a lot and really enjoyed this warm conversation. I want to encourage folks, if you are interested, to buy Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico from Karis by clicking this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. You can also buy, both of their other books from Karis. All of the ones that are available, we certainly do sell, and we would love for you to support Karis. We also encourage you, to get your local public library to carry these books, because it's really important, and that's how we make them accessible to other people. So if you have a good relationship with your public librarian, we really encourage you to let them know about this book, because it's an exciting one. Rosemary, so nice to meet you. Thank you for being a part of this tonight.
Thank you so much. And my dog is misbehaving. I'm sorry, he's making a ruckus.
No,
he just wants to be involved.
Yeah.
And Rafa, enjoy the rest of your sabbatical. Take care, and until next time, y'all have a great night.
Thank you very much,
Thank you so
everybody.
much. Bye-bye
Thanks
to
for
everybody.
coming.
Thank you.